Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. And the story I'm talking about today is episode 60 of my ongoing series, Worth 1,000 Words, where I write a 1,000 word short story inspired by a piece of artwork on the spot. And it is October, ladies and gentlemen. It is my favorite month of the year. That is the month of Halloween, of spooky things, of scary things. So I have decided that I am dedicating the month of October to the horrific. Yes, to horror stories. So for every week of October, I'm going to write a horror story. Don't worry, they're going to be different. They're not going to be all just blood and guts or monsters. I'm going to try to find different pieces of artwork that inspires something different, maybe some ghost stories, maybe things that are just maybe a little bit unsettling. I'm a massive horror fan, as you may or may not know, but I always feel intimidated writing it. I'm not sure why. I think it's just because horror needs to be effective in a certain way. It's more about dread than anything else, right? It's not about jump scares. It's not necessarily about monsters. It's about that deep-seated fear. And I think Lovecraft said it best. He really encapsulated what horror is to me in that very famous line, and I'm sure you've heard it before. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. So a lot of horror stories, a lot of films, I believe, fail in that regard when they show everything. They reveal the creature for what it is. They tell its origin story and its motivation, and it's just a terrible, terrible decision to make. So if you're working on horror, I highly suggest you take that quote into mind because it really is just going to capture the essence of what horror is, at least to me. And today's artwork is a bit interesting. I talk more about it later, but it's one that I put on the back burner for some time because it was somewhat intimidating for me to approach. But I said, you know what? Why the hell not? Let's just do this. So I did it, and I needed an unsettling soundtrack. I know I keep saying that word, but one specifically came to mind, and that is of the film Under the Skin, the soundtrack composed by Micah Levi. And it is weird. It is strange. It has lots of discordant melodies in it, and I felt like it was a perfect match with the artwork I chose. So let's check out this week's artwork. This week's artwork is titled Supper, and it is by an artist known as Insist out of Fuzhou, China. I discovered this piece some time ago and was just kind of intimidated, I guess, from doing a story. There's so much interesting imagery in this. Let's take a closer look. So really what caught my eye initially is the posters on the wall where there's these smiling people with no eyes. But then just before that, we have a man sitting at a table with his holding a spoon out toward some figure wearing, it looks like a shirt or robe or something, with a kind of a napkin draped over its head. And there is a bowl of rice in front of that person, creature, thing, with chopsticks stabbed in the top of it. Now, I came to find out that that is actually a sign of bad luck, which leads me to believe that this image has so much more symbolism to it that I probably did not grasp whatsoever. But anyway, let's look a little deeper. If you look lower in the picture, you'll see three figures. There's a young boy tucked into a ball in a cabinet. There's another, what appears to be a young boy under the table, and then off to the left is a young girl stabbing a doll with a knife. So I love this because it has so many layers to it. You kind of, your eye starts at the top, kind of in the portrait area, and then moves its way down, and then to discover all of these strange kids in the shadows at the bottom. So it's almost like layers of hell, I guess you could say. But while I let this piece of artwork just sit in my bookmarks, I kept seeing other pieces of his show up. And actually, this is part of a series. There's a lot of other images on his profile, and I highly suggest you check his stuff out. It is very horrific. It is perfect for Halloween if you're into stuff like that. But there's always this recurring theme of this figure wearing the napkin over the head or the cloth over the head, and these creepy children and this man or men. And also flowers, these sunflowers. Those are a recurring theme. So if you are of Chinese ancestry and could clue me in a little bit to what's going on here, that would be amazing because I'm so curious as to what else lurks in this picture. All right, Insist, thank you so much for this artwork. I finally found the guts to take a stab at it. I hope it does your work justice. I can look at your stuff for hours and hours and hours. So with that said, let's see what I came up with. Feng's rice would become maggots if he looked away. Though he had never witnessed this, he knew it to be true. As true as the lies the smiling faces tacked to the walls told him. But they could not see the maggots, because they had no eyes. Only skin there, bare as unmarked gravestones. Feng's dream for himself, buried deep in the earth, that unmagnificent plot, crowned with ordinary slate. The posters that trapped the smiling, eyeless people trapped him, taunted him. No matter how many times he tore them down, tore them to shreds, they returned when he wasn't looking. Only the scars of the tears and folds there to remind him that anything had changed. Nothing had changed. The broken children stirred, all three. May stabbing her doll, which had eyes, big and bright and staring as cotton entrails spilled. Feng could hear the saliva drip from May's stretched lips of glee. Little Hu, twisted as a knot, tumbling like a stone in the cabinet just behind Feng to drive him mad. But weren't they all? Finally, Dong Hai, whose presence Feng detected beneath the table, ready to bite off toes, chew knees, or simply castrate with bare hands. Feng had seen it before, with one of the broken children he'd never named. Oh, to be nameless, to not exist. A dream Feng would have had if he dreamed. Oh, to dream. These broken children were the least of his concern, though. Their knives and claws and teeth were occupied torturing other things at the moment, though his time was always near. When would it come? What sat across from Feng frightened him the most. The simple dinner of rice and old meat he'd cooked the flavor from steamed and festered between him and the curious subject. The children had let it enter through the cracked window where mold liked to grow. He had been busy shooing them away into the shadows as they chanted, "Curse on you, cut you through, belly to tongue, you are done. Bleed, 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 feed, 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 bleed, 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 feed, feed." He didn't let them finish, imprisoning them in cabinets and closets under beds. He didn't need them to finish. His mind finished their song for him. And when he had the courage to open his eyes, the figure was there, at the table, where a vase of plastic sunflowers sat. In a silk robe inlaid with gold, a cloth of the same design draped over its head. It sat silently, hands on its lap. Did it have hands? Feed, feed, feed. They fed on his sanity. Here he sat, with this new creature, uneaten rice ready to turn into maggots, to find him in his bed and bore through him while he slept. He'd wake to find himself full of holes. He'd discover the holes with his tongue first, probing them in his cheek. Then he'd run his tongue to the roof of his mouth, where some maggots were still feeding, and they'd fall into his throat to suffocate him while the ceiling appeared in fragments. Feng tore his gaze from the rice that would become maggots. You wonder why they're smiling. The robed figure did not respond. They are smiling because they cannot see. You think that would make them sad, but no. They smile because they do not need to see. And they enjoy the fact that those of us with eyes assume they are anguished. Do you see? Feng lowered his head to see what lay beyond the cloth. Nothing but shadow. Feng grit his teeth as the wet orgy of maggot rice commenced. His teeth were already worn smooth from so much grinding. They made the screech of porcelain on porcelain. Do you speak? Feng asked. He wished it would speak, scream even, anything to drown out the sound of the squirming larva, of the children's song. These children, are they yours? Are you the demon that brought them here to hover over me with knives and teeth, but never to cut, never bite? Tell them I'm ready. I am ready to be forgotten. I am ready to be buried, faceless, nameless. Fang looked to the bowl of rice he'd placed in front of the figure. It didn't writhe. His didn't either, he came to find when he checked. You play with me, Fang said. Don't you? Bringing these horrible things who should kill me but never do. Sitting there quietly while I wither to nothing, because I cannot leave this apartment and am forced to feed on whatever unfortunate thing chooses to scurry through my window. Whatever vermin the children leave in the fridge. Oh yes, I know it's them. I have seen the blood on the corners of my tucked bedsheets. I have seen the carefully hidden soiled paper. Fang thrust his spoon at one of the eyeless portraits. They see what I cannot, though they have no eyes, and they tell me things. The radio sputtered in a static voice. Curse on you, cut you through, belly to tongue, you... Fang backhanded the radio. It flew across the room, smashing into plastic shards. The batteries popped out, found the slope on the floor, and rolled and rolled and rolled. Bowling balls, then boulders, then a battering ram that hit the wall, shaking plastered dust from the ceiling. Then nothing at all, except the high-pitched smiles from the eyeless faces telling him to look, look, look. Fang looked. A pair of chopsticks stabbed the mound of rice in front of the robed figure. The eyes of the broken children rolled with a wet sound, and their lips sang with dry words. Curse on you, cut you through, belly to tongue, you are done. Bleed, 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 feed, feed, feed. Fang thrust his spoon at the robed figure, to keep the curse it brought at arm's length. His muscles soon quivered, burned like the hot light above the table, as the maggots writhed once more, just out of sight. So where to start? I think when I found the line here, Fang's rice would become maggots if he looked away. That was really the line I needed to get to kick this thing off, because where to start? There's so many places to start here. I mean, there's the creepy kids in the bottom. There are the faces. There's clearly this figure sitting there whose face you cannot see. Thankfully, that kind of established the tone, I think, for the entire thing. And so I go on to just talk about these posters and start to paint the room as I normally do, just to try to like give you the image and set the tone of everything. And also a little bit of, I guess, character development here when I'm talking about the skin, just as bare as unmarked gravestones, Fang's dream for himself buried in the earth deep, that magnificent plot crowned with ordinary slate, etc., etc. So we're getting into the head of this character, this tormented character, and I think that's kind of what I decided he would be. I decided he was plagued by these strange children who seem like they could kill him quite easily, but they, for whatever reason, never do. And then this interesting figure sitting across from him at the table with the chopsticks and the rice. And so in this paragraph, I continue on with a little bit of world building. I talk about the posters smiling, eyeless, how they taunt him, how that, when he does tear these things down, because they do look weathered, that they just appear back up. And I really wish I knew what those other documents were plastered around these portraits, because I can only imagine there's some more meaning there. And so finally, I'm establishing the three children. And, full disclosure, I had to do a quick Google search for female and male Chinese names, because I don't know very many. And I wanted to be, somewhat faithful to that culture. And I don't really spend much time with these kids. I just kind of keep them where they are as you see them. We have May, the little girl who's stabbing the doll in the corner. We have the little boy who's just stuck in that cabinet. And then finally, the little boy who's underneath the table. And they're all very disturbing images. And I think, honestly, what inspired me, I wasn't thinking about it at the time, was Junji Ito. So if you're not familiar with Junji Ito, he's a manga artist. He creates these very horrific, very just twisted and strange manga stories. And I think that I was just, somewhat, this image reminded me of something you'd see in one of his mangas, is it's just weird, odd stuff. It's not like gory or monstrous really in any way. It just has that off nature to it. So whether or not the artist is inspired by him, I'm not sure. But to me, that's kind of what I gathered. And that's what I must have of drawn from, I believe. And so this is the paragraph that I just kind of I wrap up describing who these kids are, and it kind of leads Fang, our hero, our protagonist, to go on a tangent of to not exist. So he kind of wishes death upon himself. He's tormented by these figures and wants to die, wants to be forgotten, almost in fear of maybe that they will find him after death, I guess. And finally, I bring in the strange figure. And I wish I would have, again, spent more time and really looked at this thing and maybe found out what that symbol was on the top of its head. Because I guarantee you this is definitely in Chinese folklore. It's got to be. It just has that. It screams. And it's funny, I was kind of digging through the comment section of this art on ArtStation, and it's all in Chinese. I guess I could have singularly cut and pasted and translated all this stuff, but I did not do that. The only thing I did translate was the title because it was in Chinese characters. And now here I'm talking about the origin story of this thing. The children had let it enter through the cracked window where mold liked to grow. He had been busy shooing them into the shadows as they chanted, "Curse on you, cut you through." And here I go on to the strange little song of the children. And I think the first time I heard anything like this, you see this in horror movies a lot, but first time was Nightmare on Elm Street when I was a kid, when the little song of Freddy's gonna come and get you, never sleep again. And so I threw that in here because there are children, and I just think it would be kind of creepy if they were chanting these words. And it does feed into the actual story. So it's almost prophesizing, I guess, that this figure is going to kill this man. However, the man in the image doesn't look afraid. He looks almost like he's demanding something of this figure, pointing that spoon at it, kind of an angry fashion. I mean, his face, he looks pretty upset or angry. And I like the idea of Fang chasing these kids around, right? So right when this thing comes in, it's almost as if he's, they're singing, they're driving him to madness, and he runs around and shoos them away as the best he can. And then finally, when he turns around, there's this figure there at the table. And I felt like that was an interesting cinematic. I pictured it as a film, like very chaotic camera movements as Fang kind of runs around this room to get these kids out of the way. And then finally, when he catches his breath and he turns around, this is what he sees. And then I'm establishing this area right here. And why did he decide to cook a meal? Well, feed, feed, feed. Their song tormented him, reminded him of what he was to do. So I think I deleted some of that in the final pass, but I think the spirit of it is there. And now finally we're back into the present where he's sitting here with this creature, Rice, ready to turn to maggots to find him in his bed and bore through him. And this is another little area where I slipped through into his head, where he's imagining these maggots constantly. He knows if he looks away from this bowl of rice, or he thinks anyway, they're going to turn to maggots, and then that nightmare fantasy turns into his image of them kind of slowly eating him, devouring him while he sleeps. And finally, I had Fang speak. He's addressing this figure, this creature sitting before him. And I don't know if he's being honest here, if he doesn't care anymore. At first, I thought about making him frightened before he collected himself and turned into or transformed into what you see here with his. He looks not fearful whatsoever. It almost looks like he's addressing a child. And I think that was another thought that went into my head, is that maybe this is one of the children. And I can't quite see any legs on the floor, so maybe that's what it is. I'd have to go back and look at some of the other ones to see if that's the case. But yeah, I decided to keep Fang empowered in this entire thing, with the exception of going mad, obviously. And even though he is empowered, he is taking control of this conversation, this one-sided conversation. He's kind of fearful, I think. Right here when he says, "Do you speak?" Fang asked. He wished it would speak. Scream even, anything to drown out the sound of the squirming larva. So the prospect of his rice turning into maggots are killing him. The songs of the children are killing him. And this quiet, nameless thing in front of him is definitely driving him crazy. And he flat out tells this thing, like, let them take me. I just imagine this guy in this cramped apartment with these creepy little kids running around doing who knows what, just day in and day out. And it's funny because I think if I would have taken the story a completely different direction, as if those kids were his, right? And they were just raised terribly, like animals, that could have been a different story. However, I just went with their. He doesn't know really how they got there. They've just showed up one day and they've been driving him crazy doing all kinds of strange things. And I think that maybe that leaves a little bit more interest to their anonymity, like who they are, where they came from, versus knowing they're his kids. Because then I think there's a bit of a story there. If you know they were mistreated and they grew up to be these strange things, that it's a little bit less impactful. It's almost like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of vibe. And well, I think that story could have some merit. It's not the one I chose. And I really thought about including a lot of these extraneous items into the to the story as well. Like it looks like I guess it's a TV yeah, that must be a TV off to the left. And then off to the right, I did bring the radio in though, because even though the kids are being quiet, I wanted to have that song come through and just be that driving force. Now that I'm heading toward 900 words, I'm trying to wrap it up. I'm trying to drive him completely crazy. But I did kind of break a rule to a degree. I have him pointing the spoon at the very end, and the radio is shattered. So you do see it in the painting. I try not to do that, but I did it here. It's okay. I don't know how I feel about the ending. It's interesting. It kind of loops back to the beginning, his madness. It's almost like a circle, right? This entire thing is a circle. It didn't end. I like the idea of horror as being endless. I don't like the finality of people who come out on top in horror movies. Or if they do, you always know there's something else, like it's not over. Kind of like, I think It Follows did a great job of this, where at the very end you see the boy who wanted to always be with the girl finally, and it almost appears as if things are okay, even though you know they're not. And then the camera lifts up and you see that there's something following them. And I think it's a powerful thing in horror, because horror is all about dread. It's always all about fear. And when something's defeated, the fear is gone. So I think keeping it persistent, or keeping at least it open-ended, is really the way to go with horror. And I don't mean because I want there to be a ton of sequels. Most sequels are terrible, as you know, especially with horror films. And it's rare for there to be a good horror film. Like It Follows, for instance. If there was ever a sequel to that film, it would just be terrible, because it ended in such a perfect way. I know a lot of people want to kind of re-experience the same thing again, but like in a different light with different characters maybe. But it never goes well. It's rare, I should say, that it goes well. And I think because of the cyclical nature of the film, and perhaps even the story, adding more just wouldn't do it for me. So the downside, I think, is that I created an ending, but it's not really an ending. And it does show a bit of Fang's weakness, though, because he's almost using his arm as a weapon. He's weaponizing it, and it's getting tired. It's burning as bright as that light overhead. I don't know why he thinks that it's powerful, but he does. And he's clearly not looking at his rice anymore. And so he finally, tore his eyes away from it, and then hears them writhing and squirming. So now at this point, I'm relatively happy with the story. I'm just trying to get it down to 1,000 as my final pass, my final exercise. And I think because the writing wasn't as sparse as sometimes I create the wording, is that it was a little easier to cut. But here we go. 2 words to remove. I think I go down a bit and then add some more, but I think you get the gist. I ended, I believe, at 1 hour 17, which isn't too bad. It's funny how these always seem to be the same length, and I don't know if I always think is it like a subconscious thing? Do I see the clock in the corner of my eye and know when I need to end it? And it always ends up to be about the same time. It's strange. I don't know. Sometimes I think seeing things makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. But yeah, 1 word to go, and we have hit 1,000. And there it is. Welcome to the end, dear viewer. I'm so glad you made it. This is where I talk about my final thoughts, what I liked, what I didn't like, maybe what I learned from the story. So as I said in the writing analysis, and perhaps in another part of the video, I don't remember, this piece of artwork was intimidating to me. There was so much going on that I was worried I wasn't going to capture what I wanted to, right? I wanted to know what those kids were doing there. I wanted to know the meaning of these posters with the Chinese characters written on the wall that I just could not copy and paste to Google Translate. So all I really had were the faces of the people, the positions in the room, and just what all of that conjured to me. And I thought about this after the fact, but I think Junji Ito inspired me a lot in this. Now, I wasn't thinking about his work. I'm a massive fan of his work. I wasn't thinking about it while I was writing this, but something about the music and the imagery pulled it out of my subconscious, I guess, because that's how I feel. If I had to equate something to this work, I would say Junji Ito, and I'm not saying by any means that it's as good as something he created, but just the overall vibe of it, I guess. So what did I like about this one? Well, I'm happy that I created a cohesive story. There's some nice imagery in there I like the maggots stirring. It's almost like our character's Fang, his sanity is just kind of writhing in that, right? He's being driven crazy by things that aren't there, maybe some things that are there. These children, these mysterious children, I didn't explain where they come from really, just that they've kind of always been there or for some long period of time. And I talked about this in the writing analysis, but I think a second approach would have been something like they are his children. And so because they were mistreated, they find themselves in this state. But to me, there's something not as interesting about that. Now, I love the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and I love the idea, well, in fiction, mind you, I love the idea of how nurture affects children or kids or people growing up and what they become and what situations like some horror films put these kids in and essentially create monsters. But I didn't go that way. I went the mysterious way, and I kind of like that better. I think there's something about this image, and maybe it's because there were so many things I just didn't know about it. There were so many signs I couldn't read. There were so many cultural references, most likely. The only one I did, I was alerted to, was the chopsticks being bad luck in rice. So that is where something like the curse came into play when I was having these kids chant the Curse on You song. And even after I wrote it, I just kept thinking about Fang living in this cramped apartment with all these strange little kids, this demonic cloaked figure slipping in through the window. And I like that I didn't end it. I know I talked about this a little bit in the writing analysis as well, but I like that it's just kind of this cyclical nature. I started with the maggots, I end with the maggots. The story has progressed. Fang, he's almost begging for this demon to take him, for these kids to take him. He wants to die, essentially. But they're not for some reason, because there's something more satisfying about driving him mad, I guess. And so that is why I chose to end it there. Leave a cliffhanger, I guess you could say, while his arm is literally growing tired of being held up. His only weapon pointed at this creature, this entity. Why he thinks it's going to stop it, he doesn't know, but he has asserted himself. He has dominated this situation, or so it seems. So things I didn't like. Again, I think I like the fact that I ended it, that I didn't end it, but then I also don't like the fact that I didn't end it. I don't feel like the ending was very powerful. It was okay. Like, it looped back to the beginning. It kind of conjured this image of the camera like slowly pulling out of that room, or the scene slowly fading to black just before something happens. So I guess I do like it more than I don't like it. But I think sometimes in horror especially, I view short stories like this a lot, where I think in short stories they should work like a joke, right? You have a setup and you have a punchline, the punchline being the final line or the final paragraph, the ending of the story. I don't know why I think that way about short stories, but I do. And honestly, there's very few short stories that fit that bill for me. I like walking away from a short story much like I do a novel, right? Where it's just this feeling of satisfaction, of catharsis, I guess, of me wagging my finger going, oh, you clever, clever writer. And I don't believe everything has to be that way. That's kind of what I aim for, though, when I write these short stories. Although I've been a little bit more lenient on myself lately, because I do know these just are kind of stream of consciousness. They're popping out of my head as I write them. I do very, very little editing. What I do edit, you see in the recording. So rather than beat myself up, I just kind of let the story be what it's going to be. Sometimes you end up with something great, sometimes not so good, usually in the not so good category or in the average category. And that's okay, because I think every one of these is a learning experience. It's about moving forward, not stagnating in something and never creating something. Again, why I'm trying to get away from detailed outlines. But that is for another time. So if you would like to support this channel, give me a like if you like the video, subscribe if you like story-related content. Check out my books in the description below if you want to see some of my longer form content. And keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. If you'd like to read the story in its non-video format, check the link in the description. I didn't edit anything else, promise. Thanks again.